And I am going live after 2 minutes.
Good evening, friends. On behalf of India International Center, I welcome you all to today's webinar on trial and tribulations of India's nutrition journey. In the past, we have had several eminent speakers covering different aspects of India's agriculture. Today, we have Dr. Purnima Menon, who is a senior research fellow at International Food Policy Research Institute in New Delhi. She is the team leader for South Asia nutrition programs in Poverty, Health and Nutrition Division. She is very well known on social media and she keeps highlighting the issues of nutrition. Even before fortification of rice, much before fortification of rice became an issue of public discussion, she has been writing and researching extensively on various aspects of nutrition. I'm sure that the audience of IIC is already aware of multidimensional nature of the challenges of nutrition faced by Indian population. It is not only the deficiency of iodine or the deficiency of iron or the deficiency of protein. There are multiple issues on which Dr. Menon has been writing, and she has not only been writing as a researcher, she has also been trying to persuade people to follow the advice of experts on nutrition. And her research is directed not only at India, but also at other developing countries in Asia and Africa. So I'm really thankful to her for joining, for agreeing to deliver today's webinar. I hope very soon we will be able to start the physical lectures at India International Center, maybe from next month itself. So in the Sustainable Agriculture series, this is going to be a fascinating talk today. Dr. Purnima Menon will speak for about half an hour, and then we will take questions. If you have any questions, if you have registered for the talk, you can ask questions and you can type out your questions in the chat box. Thank you very much, and over to you, Dr. Purnima Menon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussain. Really such a pleasure. I feel it's like a coming of age in some ways as as an intellectual in Delhi to be invited to speak at the IIC. And of course, I wish we had the outdoor tea and the opportunity for conversation, but I'm sure those days will come as well. Well, I am an academic, and so I think it's only fitting that I accompany my talk with at least some data and some presentation. I will speak, I think, for about half an hour or so, and then I really look forward to the conversation. I know many of the audience at the IIC are people with a great deal of experience in the world of policy, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on what I have to say. I'd like to acknowledge very much the research support that I and my research team have received through donors like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I'd also like to acknowledge very, very deeply my many research and communications and policy support colleagues at IFPRI, our various partners in research, but also the many, many policymakers and members of the policy community that I have had the privilege of working with and interacting with as a researcher, from whom I have learned tremendously. I'd like to start with asking us first the question of, why care about malnutrition? Why is it something that people like me and others have dedicated our lives, in a sense, to tackling? And I think for me, primarily, it's beyond just being something that is a human right. Every child and every human being who's on this earth has a right to be well nourished, to fulfill their own biological and intellectual potential. But we also know that it has tremendous consequences for many different reasons. It is undernutrition is a major contributor to child survival. For anyone working in the health sector who worries about why children die and what more we can do, we hear a lot more about immunization and the prevention of infections than we do about the importance of tackling malnutrition. This is changing, but still too slowly. For the rest of us, diets and what we eat are by far the biggest driver of the global burden of disease. The global epidemic of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and others are driven by poor diets. So that's another reason to be concerned about it. We know it has impacts on human capital. There is evidence on cognitive impairment due to malnutrition. There is evidence of the intergenerational impacts of poor nutrition. And more importantly, there is evidence of the gains you get on economic gains you get when you invest in malnutrition. So I think putting all of these things together, it is it inspires me to continue to work in this field, and I hope it inspires many more people to continue to walk that journey with some of us. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the work that we do, so you understand the perspectives and the frame from where I'm coming from. Today in India, the word portion is a fairly common word. The Prime Minister's overarching program for nutrition is called Portion. However, in 2011, we initiated at IFPRI a knowledge initiative called Portion, when it was a little less well known as an acronym. And what we do in that initiative is we started our work in 2011 really with the goals of supporting policy and program communities who are interested in taking action on malnutrition with multiple forms of data and evidence, because that is what we do as researchers, and that is our comparative advantage in this landscape. So in 2011, we spent almost a year trying to understand what would make sense to do in this world. We did reviews of India's policy work. We mapped stakeholders to understand who was who. We did evidence reviews. We did knowledge network reviews to see who else was doing this kinds of work. And then we built our own strategy to say, how could we be most helpful in this context? From starting around 2012 onwards, we then started to embark on unfolding our strategy to support the policy world and the policy community with evidence. We did research on a few thematic areas, and we invested very deeply even then in engaging stakeholders. We are now in sort of somewhere in between the second and third phase of that work. It still remains supported by the Gates Foundation. But we're at a point where we're doing thematic, opportunistic, and responsive research. We have expanded research partnerships. We have expanded the ways in which we engage and support people, including through the use of social media and other things. And we've also invested in capacity development, and we continue to invest in this way of working because we believe that researchers really, in difficult public policy areas have a deep responsibility to try to bring evidence and data to the large community of people who are trying to solve that problem. Being researchers, we also take an evidence-based perspective on how we might support policy with evidence. For those who haven't read it, this is a fantastic paper by Catherine Oliver and Paul Kearney, who are both in London. It's a systematic review of the do's and don'ts of how researchers might want to engage and support. They use the word influencing policy, but I view what we do much more as supporting and informing policy. I don't presume that we have the kind of influence that any of us would think we do. But for us, we really operate on some key principles. So, the idea that we have to do high quality research, that we have to invest in making research relevant and readable, that it's important that researchers understand policy and policy processes and the people who engage and design policies, that we be accessible to policymakers, that we are flexible, that we decide if we want to be issue advocates or honest brokers. And in our work, we have very much taken the perspective that we focus on being honest brokers. I will not be advocating for anything if we are not backing that up completely with evidence that problem matters. We believe in building relationships, but also in sometimes, in trying to establish ground rules. Those are not always so easy. We try to be entrepreneurial or to find people who are entrepreneurial. We will share our evidence and our research with anybody really who will listen. And we also reflect a lot internally. Are we doing what matters? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it with honesty? Are we being, maintaining our own standards? So I offer you this because I think it's important to understand, how we approach this. I'm not trying to sell research for the sake of doing it, but we are trying to be very methodical here. What kinds of evidence do we try to bring together to support the nutrition community? I sort of bucket our work in three broad areas. The first is, work that I think we were doing and we continue to do, sort of really helping people see the challenge of multiple forms of malnutrition, and I'll come to that in a bit, and of the determinants of those multiple forms of malnutrition. We try to bring evidence on the solutions, so on the implementation, the scale and the scope of old and new programs. We try to test new solutions through evaluations and other such things. And we have an emerging new body of work, which personally I find very exciting, is on understanding success stories in tackling the nutrition challenge within India. As I mentioned earlier, we also invest quite a bit in communications and engagement. So, trying to share data and evidence and creating demand for more data and evidence because, we believe it's valuable. And by demonstrating the value of it, we think that more people get excited by the idea of using data and evidence. And we've certainly seen, big shift in India in terms of how that has unfolded in the last decade. The other piece here is, we really understand and try to sort of value the idea that there is a diversity of people here who care to solve the problem of malnutrition. And I use the word care very deliberately because I think people who work in this sector or who work to change outcomes in public policy genuinely come from a place of caring. They may not all come from the same place, but the intent is to solve the problem. And I think it's critical that we accept that. But it's also a complex landscape. In 2013, we actually did some very active network mapping in 4 different states and for the national level in India. And what that really unpacks is the complexity of the landscape of actors, people who are policymakers, policy supporters, advocates, media, politicians, bureaucrats, and others who are trying to move the nutrition agenda. And so we really take the approach that what we have to think about as purveyors of evidence is of a policy community and not just 1 or 2 policy makers at the end of the day, because we need to get tipping point. We need to get to tipping point on knowledge, on discourse, and other things for policy to really move in ways that move fast, and that takes time. We've understood because from the public policy literature and our own experiences, of course, that moving an agenda in public policy is truly complex. Bringing evidence to that is also complex. In a very simplistic frame, I put it in sort of these 4 buckets. We have to get people, that whole collection of people, to recognize that we have a problem. We have to get people to align around the idea that we understand the drivers of that problem and that we agree on potential solutions. And only then do we get to tipping point where we can invest in policy instruments that relate to that problem, and then begin to learn and recalibrate policy instruments around that. Now, all of this is happening in real time. All of this is happening in a time frame where science, policy, finance, politics, administrative, societal, and cultural perspectives and priorities are moving and shifting. And in a sense, the advantage that the knowledge community has is that, we're a very stable community if you're in research or in general in the world of knowledge. And so we have a chance to sort of absorb and see all of this. Now, the reality is more like this. It's more like snakes and ladders. An issue goes up, an issue comes down. Somebody gets excited about something, it goes up a ladder. Something else comes and it goes down a ladder again. And our collective job, in a sense, is to get issues supported and moving as far high up on the ladder that it doesn't fall off. I believe very much in reflecting and using the public policy literature as well in our work, even though I'm not a political scientist. And I found Kingdom Stream's model still very relevant. The idea that both problems and solutions are, and policy and politics are all in a stream, and the coming together of those things is what gets us to tipping point. So I want to use two case studies to talk through this for nutrition in India, and I will get to rice fortification as well. So the first is, I want to start with, again, just acknowledging that there is no single nutrition challenge. SDG 2, which is focused on zero hunger, actually includes about 9 forms of malnutrition in the targets that we have set within SDG 2. What that means is that, your science, your evidence, your public policy, your programs have to systematically tackle each and every one of those targets. In the talk today, I will reflect on 2 of the malnutrition challenges: stunting among children, and then anemia. What's most important for us to absorb, again, this is older data from 2016 for India, but I just show it to you to kind of really make the point that depending on which malnutrition problem you decide to focus your efforts on, it can look very different across the country. So we absolutely cannot have, a one-size-fits-all way of looking at the challenge, even if sometimes the solutions seem like they could be widely applicable. Where you have stunting among children is not the same places where you have necessarily a lot of overweight among adults. Anemia is extremely widespread across India, but very deeply concentrated also in some key places. So I think the first thing that I would really say that anyone who's working on nutrition needs to absorb is this idea that there are multiple nutrition challenges and that we have to understand each of them and deploy solutions for each of them in a way that demonstrates a good understanding of each of those challenges. So let's talk about a really prominent challenge, one that I spent a lot of time in the last decade really working on. And that's of childhood stunting. So childhood stunting, children that are too short for their age. It has been a very long road, getting to where we are right now in India on childhood stunting, but it's certainly an issue that is still standing. When I reflect on where we are on these 4 areas of work, on recognizing that we have a problem, on aligning and agreeing on drivers and acting, I will tell you, this is not something that has moved in a year or 2 years. This is something that has taken a decade for us to move. So first, on recognizing that there was a problem in and of itself and accepting that there was a problem. This was almost a 5-year-long process, and I'll come to that in a minute. So between about 2008 and 2013, there just was a lot of discussion and debate around this. There was problem denial. Indian children don't grow the same as, the standards that they are being compared to. We should be measuring our kids differently. There was a lack of appreciation that stunting, a binary indicator, which is really just set based on the statistical distribution, is actually an indicator of very complex biological process of linear growth, of the growth of bones and the body. And then there was confusion and conflation around the idea of, what happens in an individual versus what happens in populations. There was a lot of work that happened on the drivers. So to identify a solution, you have to pitch that or park that solution onto one of the determinants of the problem. You don't reach or solve the problem of child growth without working on the things that affect child growth. But this is not an easy path for people to have followed. You have to then agree on the solutions that speak to each of those drivers. So if sanitation is a problem, is why, or at least one of the reasons why India's children are malnourished, what is the solution to that problem? If ICDS or not enough food is one of the drivers, what is the solution to that? There has been a lot of huge need for us to align around these things. And it was a years-long process, even within the nutrition community, leave alone outside of the nutrition community. And then came the aspects of the investments in the policy instruments and the extent to which they actually align with our understanding of what the drivers are and what the solutions would be that fit there. Policy instruments in India have been very ICDS-centric. The food and feeding bias has remained strong, but still we have not been able to achieve quality, reach, and equity even around that one single major policy instrument. We are in a new solution space now around the discourse around childhood stunting. We understand the importance of parental behaviors. We understand the importance of multiple sectors. However, the basic financing and other aspects of delivering those programs is still inadequate, and the recognition of social determinants remains particularly poor, which means that we are in a place where the recalibration is still going to take a lot more investment, and many of us are actually working on that. I mean, I will tell you that even recalibrating the component of a policy instrument, such as reforming the food supplements in the ICDS, is a years-long process. And some of the other research that we've been doing around this on success cases in malnutrition and stunting reduction is still not fully embedded in strategies because we are not putting effort behind the idea that social determinants matter tremendously for these outcomes. So the story of problem recognition for stunting is particularly interesting and important. In 2008, there was some acceptance of this, that there was sort of, the Prime Minister then mentioned and talked about it being a shame and a curse. But then between 2009 and 2014, there was a lot of denial around the growth standards in particular. And it came to a point where in 2013, there was finally an EPW collection of articles, the 6 articles that are here, written by people from many, many different sectors: economists, child growth experts, child nutrition experts, pediatricians, the rights community, basically the entire sort of diversity of people who'd been worrying about this issue, who basically came together and said, listen, we just have to stop discussing this particular issue of standards. This is a real problem. Let's move on. And it's only really after that that I think we came to that tipping point where the problem was no longer being denied or debated. It was really going to be about what are we going to do about that. That required understanding the determinants of the problem. We had work on sanitation from Dean Spears and many colleagues working on that, who basically said, this is it. So for a while, the discourse was on sanitation. There was work by Seema Jayachandran and Rohini Pandey, which really brought up the issue of gender and patriarchy. So for a while, the discourse was around that. And then there were others among us, Subbu Subramanian from Harvard, myself, and others who really spoke about this, saying that, this is really a multifactorial and a complex problem that requires us to tackle those complex social determinants. And we're still saying that, but our policy instruments still haven't caught up fully to that, even though we've recognized that in the problem framing that one sees in things like Poshan Abhiyan. We have tremendous lessons now from Indian states that reduce stunting. This is no longer a gloom and doom narrative for India, but what we have found there again is that when you look at the factors that come together to contribute to change over time, these are all studies that have looked at change over time. What you see again is the importance of the multi-sectoral solutions, the things that come together that address not just the health and nutrition interventions, where policy work is very focused, but also the things that relate to the conditions in which children grow, the condition of their mothers, the conditions of their homes. But we've learned a lot about how to make this happen, and I'm really looking to see what the next phase will look like. We have learned that it's possible to achieve this change, that our programs have made a difference, but also that it has really taken a vision. It has taken capable and stable bureaucrats who were given time and space. It has taken financing, efforts to strengthen implementation systems, catalysts and champions of various kinds, including the media, civil society, human rights commissions, politicians, bureaucrats, really all of society. So I think, lots of hope that change is possible, but also a really strong sense that this will really take more than just one policy instrument or one program. Despite the successes, though, on stunting reduction, what really matters, as I mentioned, stunting is a statistical. The decision about whether a child is classified as stunted or not is literally whether they are on this side or the other side of that -2 standard deviations line on the distribution of their heights. But what's more important is that that entire distribution needs to move to the right to get closer to the WHO reference distribution, which is the blue line. And what you see is that, even though we are inching forward, that change is still going to be some years in coming. And it is just a reminder that we have to spend, quite a bit of effort just staying the course now on something like stunting. Apologies, I'm just going to move my timer. Now, what's important also here to recognize is that, when we start looking at data and when we start measuring and interpreting and things like that, we're now at a point where we are looking at, the data from the NFHS that is coming out, collected in 2019-20. We look at the children who are under 5 to look at stunting and other child growth outcomes. When we get to sort of the fullness of the analysis related to those things, we really need to consider the biology of child growth and what we know about that, the evolution of policies over the 5-year period in which preceded, the surveys. We need to look at the reach and the quality of programs in the wider social and economic context. All of these together affect the conditions in which children grow on a day-to-day basis. And a full analysis and interpretation really needs to pull all of that together. And many of us in the nutrition research community are very committed to doing that. So I want to come now to my next case study. And really just close on the stunting case to say, it has been a very long journey, but it's a journey that actually is at a very good point right now. We have a fully launched mission. We have a mission that recognizes the multi-factorial nature of the drivers of child growth challenges like stunting or poor linear growth. And we have success cases from within India. But the challenge there now is to not lose hope, to not lose energy, and to focus efforts where the most children are born and where the challenges is the greatest. So there is still a way to go here. There is no time to lose, and there should be no sleep for the weary around this. Now let's look at anemia. I want to use the same frame, recognizing the problem, agreeing on drivers, investing in policy instruments, and then supporting the learning. And unlike the child stunting challenge, where, as I said, we're still standing and are fairly aligned, the policy community, the research community, and where the programs and policies are at this point in time. But the forward movement is very, very important there. With anemia, it was a bit of a late start, and I think the current discourse that is happening, which is very important. I think any discourse around public policy is very, very important. But it's hampered by challenges both around the problem alignment and a range of solution tussles, which need to be resolved in a way to help us move forward productively. So the challenges that we have at hand are, there are questions about, is anemia a problem? For which age groups is it a problem? How big of a problem is it? What do we know about the drivers of anemia? What do we know about what solutions pertain to those drivers? Are we going to be able to align around that? Where are things at right now in public policy? And I'll come to that in a minute. And what is the place and what is it that happens when you introduce sort of new policy instruments into this landscape? What does that do to us in the context of this, snakes and ladders view of looking at the world? at a very fundamental level, I think we must never forget biology. I mean, these are all biological outcomes. I mean, yes, we look at data and it's statistical, but at the most fundamental level, this is about human biology. And so any work and any sort of solutions and problem characterization have to come into sort of engaging around all of that as well. And I think this is where we, having sort of a very broad set of public policy actors is helpful, because we see, all of that. Similar to the stunting story, where are we at in terms of the problem definition and its determinants in the context of anemia right now, which is being discussed a lot because of the introduction of the new policy instrument. People who've been working on anemia have been working very hard on it for the last 3 to 4 years under the Anemia Parrot campaign, which started in 2018. But the public discourse around anemia has sort of rejuvenated itself now around the rice fortification debates. So the problem characterization itself right now is a bit challenging, because anemia seems to be not improving as measured in the NFHS. The fact sheets show worsening or stagnant anemia situations in most states. However, we have data from another survey, the Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey, but the CNNS survey and the NFHS actually measured the problem of anemia differently. They used 2 different estimation methods. One used blood from capillaries, finger pricks. The other used venous blood. They used different instruments and lab methods. But they use, if you apply the same standard anemia cutoffs, then the CNNS estimates are a little bit lower than the NFHS estimates. But they're still high. 40% of anemia, any way you look at it, is still a public health problem. There are suggestions that the problem is smaller than previously thought, and that the hemoglobin cutoffs again in India. So again, sort of the standards level discussion is happening here again. That it should be a little bit lower than WHO. But even then, even if we applied those standards or a new cutoff, you would still have 100 million women of reproductive age in anemia who would be anemic. Now, anemia, which is low hemoglobin levels in the blood, is again, it's a marker for a whole range of complex biological processes. And the determinants and characteristics of that anemia are still being understood. There's evidence that there are different types of anemia in younger versus older children. There is recognition that there are regional differences in etiology. A study in UP recently suggested a fairly strong role for dietary iron. In other locations where there is a lot of malaria, there are inflammation reasons for the anemia, there are thalassemias, etc. So that understanding needs to be quite nuanced. And then again, where we've done work on change over time, this is work done by my research team, we've understood that the non-nutritional determinants also play quite an important role. Anemia solutions in India, as with stunting, have moved on to, to a very good place in terms of embracing the complexity of the problem and the range of solutions that need to be in place. So if you were in India and, in sort of the late and early 2010s, you would be hearing more about iron and programs that were trying to deliver iron supplements to children than you would about policy instruments that were trying to address other challenges here. In 2018, a new national strategy came out focused on anemia called the Anemia Parrot campaign. A lot of people have come together in designing it, defining it, doing research on it, providing insights on how it works. But the core there is that it's recognized 6 gap population groups that suffer from the challenge. So it's a 6x6 strategy, 6x6x6 strategy, 6 beneficiary groups, 6 interventions, and 6 institutional mechanisms that again recognize the salience of other ministries and other challenges. And an evidence support team from across medical colleges and other communities. This does include the idea that fortified foods in public programs are an important contributor to part of the solution space. So where does rice fortification fit into this? It's clearly parked. So the idea that you should get more iron from the food you eat is clearly recognized in the Anemia Parrot strategy. A new solution, which was introduced and sort of really spoken about very prominently by the Prime Minister, has in a sense rejigged the discourse on anemia right now. And a lot of questions have come up about the impact of this, about the potential for toxicity, about the politics of this, about who benefits from it in terms of corporate beneficiaries versus the public, the role of diets versus a fortified commodity, et cetera, et cetera. So it has been sort of a very expansive discourse. But what is the evidence on the solution itself? And a wonderful colleague of mine, Dr. Sam Scott, did a little evidence compilation for us. And what we see on the rice fortification piece itself is that the global evidence suggests that rice fortification as a strategy does have some potential for impact, and of course has potential to reach large swaths of the population, which is why the idea of fortification is embedded in Anemia Parrot, sort of recognizing that we have a population-wide problem here. When you look at the local evidence in India, there are a few published studies which have tested fortified rice kernels in South Asia. Unfortunately, many of those studies are actually difficult to compare given different fortificant profiles and inclusion criteria and so on and so forth, and some also contain some design flaws. So what we're left with is some very well done studies, and then the global evidence, and then some less well done studies, which overall together suggest that sure, fortified rice may have a small positive impact on anemia. It does say that no impact is expected where populations have low baseline prevalences of anemia or iron deficiency. And on that front, I think what we have is a large population with a large challenge. And so far, no studies have found adverse effects of fortification in terms of morbidity. Some of the questions that are being raised relate to very long-term, potentially long-term kinds of impacts. So, we have to ask, so where does this leave you now, where you have this evidence that something at population scale could have small impacts? And there are many who will argue that when you have very, very large populations with a challenge, even a small change there affects very, very large numbers. And so, we should not necessarily discard things just because they have small impacts. But I think what we're faced with right now is that, you have a national program. Rice fortification is beginning to roll out in many different places. Regardless of which study we have reviewed in the context of rice fortification in India, pretty much every single study has concluded saying that further studies are needed to show the technical feasibility on a large scale. The effectiveness of the strategy should be tested further. Large-scale community-based trials are warranted. They acknowledge that it's an opportunity, but really, really make the point that evidence is crucial to inform the scale-up. And so I think that's where we are sitting right now. A program is beginning to roll out. And I think the challenge here for the nutrition community, for the government, for people who are both believers in the potential of a program like this, and people who are really concerned about many different things, I think this is an important opportunity to come together, to clarify those concerns, and to build the evidence together around this, to say, what can we learn about whether this works or not, what helps it work or not, what kinds of impact it has, and for whom. And then, be willing to come together again and recalibrate our own priors on, what this looks like. Without a doubt, diets, what we eat, they matter to all forms of malnutrition. So whether you're thinking about stunting and linear growth, or anemia, or overweight, or obesity, that matters to all forms of malnutrition. It affects deeply both human health of all kinds and planetary health. In India, we are in a situation right now where we understand this, but we don't actually have the data to know how people in India are eating today. Part of the rice fortification agenda here, where on the one hand, you have people talking about how important a contribution fortification can make. And on the other hand, we have people saying that, what's important here is ensuring a diversity of diets. There are those of us who say, listen, we should do both potentially, but more importantly, we really need to learn how people access food, what they're currently eating. We recognize that many components of the food system are converging on the same geographies, the same individuals. Food markets are changing. Public programs are providing food. People are growing local crops. And I really sit in the camp of those people who say there will never be a single magic bullet. Fortification sounds appealing for some reasons. Dietary diversity is absolutely critical. There is no denying that. But our efforts to reach there are also hampered by evidence that nutritious diets are currently in India very, very unaffordable for the majority of our population. And so I think we have to really come together around this issue of food, nutrition, diets, and our quest to make this work for the population at large by understanding what's going on. We have an NSSO survey from 17-18, which provided some insights on consumption, which has not been released to the public. There is the NNMB surveys, which were done last in 2012, 2013, and the last urban NNMB, which was the last National Nutrition Monitoring Board set of surveys, was from 15-16. We are today in 2021. We are trying to make public policy around food without understanding what that looks like for the population. And that could be very dangerous, frankly dangerous, to be making public policy without actually knowing what the state of the challenge there around food-related issues actually looks like. So I'm making sort of a major call for an investment in getting that data together. I want to conclude with just a couple of remarks here on connecting the dots between evidence and policy, and just say, what is it that scientists like us who care about supporting policy communities can do? I think we just have to, to stay grounded, firstly, in what we do and what we do well, which is staying grounded in data and evidence. We need to embrace complexity. The snakes and ladders thing is not something to be frustrated about. It is just reality. It is the reality of life, not just the reality of public policy, but it is particularly the reality of public policy. Scientists have to align. We cannot just be about my science or your science, but we have to be about science as a whole. We need to be available. We need to be proactive. We need to connect and bring people in. We recognize our limited power as scientists, but we can never give up. And most importantly for me, I feel like I have to invest continuously in learning. The world of public policy is phenomenally complicated, but what I take away from it is that people who are there are really people who care to make a difference, and it's our job to support that. I do believe policymakers in the policy community can do a lot to walk alongside with people like us who are scientists, stay informed, engage with and listen to scientists and invest in data to support good science. Very importantly, the institutionalization of processes to absorb the fullness of evidence and data is really, really important. I find it remarkable that any scientific task force in India has not just scientists, but also serving government officials and bureaucrats. And if what we want is science, then we should keep the policy and politics out of it. We should listen to what the collection of scientists has to say, let them discuss, debate, and then take it to the team that needs to figure out how to use that science in the context of policy. If we try to do it all together in the same task force, sometimes science wins, sometimes politics wins, but the people who don't win are the people. So I want to close by saying that India's malnutrition challenge itself will take much more than a national program, than a nutrition program. It will take many stakeholders to stay together around what is truly a multifaceted agenda for change. We have to work on food systems. We have to work on health systems. And these are probably the easy things. What's more difficult is for us to work on the social systems that support, women like this young woman who I met in UP several years ago, who live in very difficult and precarious conditions. And we really, truly have to accept that the economic systems and conditions underpin what happens in people's lives. I want to close with a tribute to a dear friend of ours and a friend of India's who passed away yesterday, who wrote about SDG 4 and education in the last year of his life. And I think what he said is tremendously powerful. It is tremendously relevant also for what we are doing on SDG 2 and SDG 3. And these are his words from his blog. And the person is Girindra Bihari, who was the director of the Gates Foundation's India Country Office for several years and is a dear friend. And he really says, for me to focus is to invite a convergence of effort. It is to really take the task seriously, to make every effort to understand the root causes, to align collective action, to review progress, and to really have an honest conversation about what needs to change. So I paraphrase his words, and I offer these in tribute because I think that's what we're trying to do as scientists. That's what we're trying to do as people who want to support public policy, to move in the right place, create honest conversations, and help further understanding. So thank you again so very much to the IIC for this tremendous opportunity. And I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Menon, for this very thorough and academic presentation. I'm sure the participants will look at the sources if they are interested in this subject. Now, before I take the questions, I'll just spend a few minutes explaining the context. Even before COVID-19 pandemic hit the world, some 26% of world's population, about 2 billion people, faced moderate or severe food insecurity. And even before the pandemic, it was realized that the target of zero hunger is unlikely to be achieved by 2030. So that was a bad news, and about 2 billion people did not have access to sufficient and safe, nutritious food. Now, what has the pandemic done to the issue of undernourishment, which includes malnourishment, overnourishment, vitamin deficiency, iron deficiency, etc. So the numbers have gone up everywhere. The FAO's 2021 report shows that the numbers of undernourished have gone up by 28 crores in Africa and 42 crores in India. If we take the world as a whole, that some 85 crore, some additional 16 crore people have gone into various kinds of undernourishment. So, which means that the policymakers are going to face severe problems in addressing the issues of malnutrition. In Asia alone, some 4.7 crore people have gone into undernourishment due to the pandemic. Now, what are the, one of the participants, Savita Gautam, is asking what are the unexplained factors for the stunting slide. There, you mentioned that there are certain unexplained factors. What are these factors? And I would like to add, are there any states, which states of India have done better in reducing the incidence of stunting, and which are the states where the situation has worsened?
Both really great questions. So the first one is, the analysis that we had done on trying to explain the factors that contributed to change in stunting. They're based on data from the NFHS, and one of the features of the NFHS which is an incredible data set, of course, is that it actually doesn't have data on absolutely everything that relates to the problem of malnutrition. So, for example, it does not have data on food security and does not have data on actual diets. And so when you run statistical models, you do end up with a situation where some of the change that you see over time cannot be fully explained because you don't necessarily have all the data that helps you explain that change. So I hope that helps to clarify. It's a statistical sort of piece when we say that that proportion of change was unexplained. Now, as to the states that are doing well, so the analysis that we had done was between NFHS 3 and NFHS 4, which is between 2006 and 2016, and we're now starting to look at a few states where emerging data is coming between NFHS 4 and 5, which is 16 and 19. So in that time period, we looked at Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, and Tamil Nadu as 4 states. And we did Tamil Nadu more because it's a historical success case in tackling malnutrition and sort of deploying a whole set of social development agenda that has been quite transformative. But the other 3 states were chosen as states which had seen in absolute proportion number of sort of percentage decline in stunting, and all of that work is published and available on our website, by the way. So we invite you to look at those. There are other collaborators and colleagues that we are working with now who are looking at West Bengal, who are looking at Punjab, and who are looking, I believe, at Himachal. The states that had not made progress between 2006 and 16 were, it was very slow in UP, very slow in Bihar, very slow in Jharkhand. The improvements in stunting were there in those 3 states, but they were very slow, much below national average. And the challenge when progress is slow in large states, where the numbers of children are large, is that your national progress is also slowed down. So I think between NFHS 4 and 5, what we've seen is that it looks like Bihar has accelerated progress now. And we're looking into that a little bit more carefully and trying to do these, success change analyses. And the beauty of, a state like Bihar, again, this is that issue of small change, large population, is that it's when you get even small change in big states, big population states like Bihar and like UP, is when you're going to start to see India's national average changing. We still don't know what that looks like because the full set of national figures is not out. But I'm hopeful when I see change, even if it's small, in large states. It means that things are slowly starting to move. I hope that's helpful. This is a continuing agenda for research and discussion.
Thank you. So it is clear that the North Indian states are basically responsible for poor indicators of India. Now, Dr. Savita is asking another question. In today's Mint, there is a long story about fortification of rice and fortification of milk, etc. So my friend Shanthan Bera has written this long story. Many of you would have seen. And one of the highlights of that story is that Amul, the largest cooperative in India, the largest milk producer in the organized sector, has not found merit in fortifying milk. So there must be some very strong reasons why Amul has not found it fit to fortify the milk. So she is asking, Dr. Savita is asking whether it is a good policy to fortify the entire quantity of rice, some 30 million tons, which will be distributed under the public distribution system. Does it really help?
So where the evidence has been available on large-scale food fortification, is very much from in the Western world, and it is around certain kinds of public health problems. There is evidence around anemia in the context of the Women, Infants, and Children's program in the US. There is evidence around neural tube defects and fortification, especially with B vitamins in that context. As with many other things, fortification is not a panacea. And I think the biggest mistake we make right now is assuming that the people who are advocating for it are advocating for it as an only solution. I'm not one of those. I'm more curious about it and about how the policy itself is made and all of that. And then also I'm very curious about how it's going to play out. I would say we don't know very much about, I should say in Guatemala, there were studies that showed that, interestingly enough, the fortification of sugar with vitamin A almost completely wiped out vitamin A deficiency. There are studies showing that there were sort of surveillance studies happening, tracking vitamin A deficiency. And, they just, there was evidence that had made some big differences. So I think that there is evidence from several places. We don't have that kind of large-scale evidence from India yet. It's why many of us are saying that public policy agenda absolutely needs to be accompanied by an evidence generation agenda. Right now you're having a big discourse that is full of maybes. it may be this, it may have these effects, it may solve the public health problem, it may have toxicity effects, it may put more money in the hands of X or Y, it may not be consumed by people. The only way to sort of tackle each of those concerns, and they're all legitimate concerns, all raised by thoughtful people. So I don't personally, discard any of those concerns. But there is truly in my mind, and of course I'm biased, I'm a researcher, to tackle those concerns is to say, fine, you tell me what you're worried about, you tell me what you're worried about. We'll bring the data together. Let's look at it together. Otherwise we'll just be, throwing brickbats at each other in the ether and not actually having a conversation that's grounded. And it can only be grounded in data that is thoughtfully, transparently collected. You can't have one set of people throwing one thing. So I think this is a really, could be a very amazing opportunity for people who believe in knowledge brokering, for people who believe in the value of bringing people together. But it's going to take investment. It's going to take different people accepting to engage in difficult conversations. And of course, what's most important here is that we track what's happening with the program, track what's happening with uptake. Do no harm needs to be a very important principle here. And you need to have some signals for when you decide that, the data that is telling you about any potential harm has to, you have to have a way to stop something if you find that it is harmful. So that's where I sit on that. I think this is a very important space for, the program is not going away. It's been announced from the highest offices. It is rolling through the systems. We have a job to do, which is to inform it, I think.
Okay. Now, a study by Kharas in 2018 projected that India will still account for about 33% of stunted children under 5 years by 2030. And he had also written that 21% of wasted children worldwide will be in India. So these are very disturbing statistics. Do you think India is on way to have lower numbers by 2031? Do you think the announcement made today to launch Poshan as a massive scheme is going to address these issues? Or if I asked you, what are a couple of things to be done by these so-called poorer performing states in North India, what should they be doing, which they have not done so far?
So what they should be doing is taking social determinants very, very seriously. Very, very seriously. India is one of the few countries in the world that seems to be rolling out a nutrition program without social protection or social safety nets being really fully integrated into that. It's the social safety nets exist. The nutrition discussion is happening separate from those. We really have to try to bring those things together. And there are some very important social determinants here that relate to, the outcomes of childhood stunting and childhood wasting that you raised. They're both outcomes that relate to how children grow. Children's physical growth happens in their homes at a very early point in their lives, in the first 2 years of after birth, and of course, in the wombs of their mothers. Any effort that wants to address how children grow has to first pay attention to supporting the mothers of those children. We have public policy programs that, are not fully sort of oriented to the idea that you have to support women, you have to support parents, you have to make things easier for parents, not make things more difficult, not ask them to do more things. It's a very difficult time in your life to be the parent of a young child. And the programs have to be supportive to that. So that's one, and social assistance and social safety nets have a big role to play there. The second social agenda here is very much around women. So in states like Bihar, in states, especially in Eastern India, so Bihar, West Bengal, etc., early childbearing coming from early marriage is very high. We have, a bunch of research that shows that this is a very big risk factor for having, poor child growth outcomes, because certainly young girls or, girls should not be mothers. That's another social, sort of social determinants agenda that has to be taken seriously. And it's not just, from the legal wand perspective. I mean, we have a legal act that says that there should be no early marriage, and yet it happens. So it's about taking the perspective of understanding those social challenges and trying to figure out what is it that we can do in public policy, in society, and beyond. And the numbers are very high in those states. I mean, there are 27 million odd babies born in India each year. Probably 5 million of those are born in UP. It's an enormous number, enormous number. Those are very large numbers and concentrated in one state. The public policy outcomes and actions then are reliant completely on the machinery that operates in one state. And so, it is going to take a lot of work. UP, Bihar, these are big states where big change needs to start happening.
Okay, thank you. Now, we still have 2 minutes, another 2 minutes. So I have a question. What do you think of the distribution of Panjiri in states like UP under the programs, for very young children? Do you think they should also be given cooked food, or do you think Panjiri is good enough?
So I think it depends on the age group of the children. My understanding of the Panjiri type take-home rations is that they are primarily for children 0 to 3 years of age who are, mostly at home, where the children are coming to the centers. I believe in most states now they're getting hot cooked meals. Whatever happens with either of these, what I think about it is less important than what the parent of that young child thinks about it. And this is again where I come back to, do we have the kind of knowledge and research that informs our program? I have not seen a packet of that Panjiri to know whether it's good enough to eat. I know there's been a lot of improvement actually in the take-home rations in the ICDS in UP. There were packaging improvements, supply chain improvements. I believe there's been some work on, on integrating it more strongly with the ICDS. And actually, I look forward to learning more about it. But again, it's not, for me, this is not about one thing. That baby who's born to that mother grows up in their home. If the Panjiri or the take-home ration makes it easier for the mother to do her job, then it's contributing. If it's of poor quality, not nutritionally adequate, if it's not being used correctly, then it's contributing to the problem and not the solution. And I think that there are ways to learn ground up about how this is working for the people of UP, not so much what Purnima thinks would need to be informed by what data becomes available.
Okay, good. Thank you. Now, we will conclude this session today, this very knowledgeable session in which we have got to know a lot more about the issues relating to nutrition. The world has a problem on its hands. 16 crore more people are now suffering from undernourishment as a result of the pandemic. So the number was, already very high, some 69 crores in 2019, and now it is touching 85 crores. So there is an enormous challenge, and I'm sure that the participants in today's discussion will have understood the challenges which India is facing. Thank you very much. Thank you, India International Center, for hosting this series of lectures, and thank you, Dr. Purnima Menon, for finding time for this. All the lectures in this series are already available on the website of India International Center, but I'm requesting IIC to put up links to all the lectures at one place on one page, so that it becomes easier for viewers to access them. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity.